Vasily Kozlov lined up the shot perfectly. The German officer stood 400 meters away, completely exposed, lighting a cigarette outside a makeshift command post. It was February 1943, the ruins of Stalingrad still smoldering around them. An easy kill. Vasily had made harder shots dozens of times before. His finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze, and another enemy would be dead. One less Nazi to fight. One small contribution to the war effort that had already cost Vasily everything he'd once loved. But Vasily didn't pull the trigger. Not that day. Not ever again. Because of what he'd found in a German supply crate 3 hours earlier, an unfinished letter from that same German officer to his daughter, explaining why her father had to fight a war he no longer believed in. This is the story of how an enemy's incomplete thoughts stopped a Soviet sniper from completing his mission, and changed the trajectory of two lives that should never have intersected. Vasily Kozlov was 26 years old when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. He'd been a schoolteacher in a small village outside Kiev, married for 3 years to Elena, expecting their first child. He taught literature and poetry, believed in the power of words to shape young minds, and had never held a gun until the invasion began. War came to his village in July. Vasily's students, boys he'd taught to read, to think, to question, were conscripted or killed. The Germans burned the school. Elena, 7 months pregnant, fled east with other refugees. Vasily tried to follow but was separated in the chaos. He never saw her again. The Red Army found Vasily wandering near Kharkov, starving and desperate. They gave him a rifle and 30 minutes of training. "Point that end at Germans," a sergeant said. "Pull trigger. Not complicated." But it was complicated. Vasily's first firefight was chaos, noise, smoke, terror, death. He shot his rifle wildly, hitting nothing. Men around him fell. He survived more through luck than skill. When it ended, he sat in a crater shaking so hard he couldn't light a cigarette. A grizzled sergeant, Viktor Petrov, found him there. "Teacher, right?" Viktor said, reading Vasily's papers. "You teach boys to read poems. Now you teach fascists to die. Is same thing, just different lesson." Vasily wanted to protest that they were nothing alike. Teaching and killing occupied opposite ends of human endeavor. But he said nothing. What was the point? Elena was gone, probably dead, certainly lost. His school was ashes. His students were corpses. Nothing remained of the life he'd built. So Vasily learned to kill. Not because he hated Germans particularly, but because he had nothing else left to do. The Red Army was now his only family. Revenge his only purpose. He discovered he had a talent for it. His teacher's patience translated well to sniping. The careful observation, the waiting, the precise moment of action. These were skills he'd used to identify which student needed help, which concept required extra time. Now he used them to identify targets, calculate wind and distance, choose the perfect moment to fire. By December 1941, Vasily was assigned to a sniper unit. By spring 1942, he had 43 confirmed kills. By Stalingrad in November, that number had reached 97. He kept count in a small notebook, the same kind he'd once used for lesson plans. Each tally mark represented an enemy who would never go home, never see family again, never rebuild what war had destroyed. Vasily told himself he felt nothing about these kills. They were fascist invaders. They'd burned his village, killed his students, taken his wife. They deserved death. The tally marks were justice, not murder. But sometimes, late at night, Vasily would remember teaching Pushkin to 14-year-olds. "Poetry," he'd told them, "is how we preserve our humanity." Words written centuries ago can still touch our souls today. That's the power of honest expression. One student, Dmitri, had asked, "But what if the words describe terrible things? What if the poet saw war and death?" "Then the words are even more important," Vasily had answered, "because they remind us that even in darkness, someone tried to stay human. Someone refused to let horror have the final word." Now, Vasily wondered what words he would write about his own darkness. What poetry could capture 97 deaths? What honest expression could preserve humanity he no longer felt? The Battle of Stalingrad began in August 1942 and descended into hell by September. Vasily's unit fought building to building, room to room, sometimes floor to floor in the same structure. The city became a graveyard. Both sides fed men into the meat grinder, and both sides lost them just as quickly. Vasily adapted. He moved through ruins like a ghost, setting up in unexpected positions, taking shots, relocating before German counter-snipers could respond. He killed methodically, efficiently, without emotion. The tally marks accumulated. By February 1943, as German forces began their final collapse in Stalingrad, Vasily had reached 126 confirmed kills. He was mentioned in dispatches, recommended for medals, interviewed by political officers about his motivation and dedication. "I fight for the motherland," he told them, using the expected phrases. "Every fascist I kill brings us closer to victory." They nodded, satisfied. They wanted simple narratives. Heroes who killed without doubt, patriots who never questioned. Vasily gave them what they wanted. But at night, alone in whatever hole he'd claimed as shelter, he sometimes opened his notebook and looked at the tally marks. 126 men who'd been alive and then weren't. 126 families who'd lost fathers, sons, brothers. 126 people who probably hadn't chosen war any more than Vasily had. He tried to push these thoughts away. Sympathy for the enemy was dangerous. It made killing harder. And killing was all he had left. On February 16, 1943, Vasily's unit advanced into what had been a German administrative sector. The enemy was in full retreat, abandoning positions, leaving supplies behind. Standard procedure was to search everything for intelligence, weapons, food, anything useful. Vasily searched a half-collapsed building that had served as some kind of headquarters. Papers everywhere, mostly destroyed or worthless. Supply manifests, duty rosters, propaganda materials. He gathered what might have intelligence value and prepared to move on. Then he saw the wooden crate. It was small, personal, not standard military issue. Someone's private belongings, left behind in hasty retreat. Vasily almost ignored it. Personal effects rarely contained anything useful. But something made him look inside. Letters, dozens of them. Some sent, returned for being undeliverable. Some unsent, never completed. Photographs, a child's drawing, and one letter, half-written, ink still relatively fresh. Vasily knew he should leave it. Enemy correspondence was intelligence material, should go to proper authorities. But he'd learned enough German from captured documents to read basic text. And the first line of the unfinished letter caught his attention. "Mein liebes Gretchen." My dear Gretchen. Vasily opened the letter fully. His German was rough, but sufficient to understand the content. It was dated February 13th, 3 days earlier, written by a Major Hans Weber to his daughter. "My dear Gretchen," the letter began, "I'm writing this, knowing I may not finish it. We're preparing to evacuate our position. Everything is chaos. But I wanted you to know some things, just in case this is the last chance I have to tell you. Vasily should have stopped reading. This was enemy correspondence, personal material that had no tactical value. But something in the tone, the quiet resignation, the father trying to explain himself to a daughter, compelled him to continue. "You're 8 years old now. I've missed 2 of your birthdays because of this war. Your mother sends me your drawings, and I keep them all. You draw our house, our garden, our dog Fritz. You draw a tall stick figure that you label Papa, and it's always standing far away from the house. I think you understand, even at 8, that Papa is gone and might not come back. I want to explain why I'm here, why I left you and Mama. You're too young to understand now, but someday you'll ask these questions, and I want you to have answers, even if I'm not there to give them to you myself." Vasily's hands trembled slightly. This was too intimate. Reading this felt like violation, but he couldn't stop. "I didn't want this war, Gretchen. I know that might sound strange to you someday, when they teach you in school about Germany's glorious campaigns. But it's the truth. I was a teacher. Did you know that? Before I became a soldier, I taught mathematics at a gymnasium in Dresden. I loved teaching. I loved helping young people understand how numbers could explain the world." Vasily's breath caught. A teacher. This German major had been a teacher, just like him. "When the war started, I had choices. I could have refused to serve. Some men did. But refusing meant consequences, not just for me, but for your mother, for you. Men who refused were labeled traitors. Their families suffered. I couldn't do that to you both. So I told myself I was serving to protect you, fighting to keep our country safe, to give you a better future. For a long time I believed that. The propaganda makes it easy to believe. They tell you the enemy is subhuman, that we're bringing civilization, that our cause is just. But then you see things, Gretchen, things that make those stories hard to believe. You see villages burned, civilians shot, cruelty that serves no military purpose. You see young men, boys, really, some of them younger than my students, dying in snow and mud for causes they don't understand. And you start to wonder, what am I protecting? What better future am I building? How does any of this keep you safe?" The letter continued, but the ink trailed off, as if Weber had been interrupted, and never returned to finish his thoughts. The final legible sentence read, "I don't know how to be a good father and a good soldier simultaneously. Maybe it's impossible. Maybe I've failed at both. But I want you to know." And there it ended. Mid-sentence. Mid-thought. Whatever Weber wanted his daughter to know remained unwritten, locked in his mind. Vasily sat in the ruins, holding this unfinished letter from an enemy officer who'd been a teacher, who had a daughter, who questioned the war, who wanted to explain himself, but ran out of time. He thought about Elena. If their child had survived, if she'd given birth before whatever happened to her happened, would that child be 8 now? Would Vasily have written similar letters, trying to explain why Papa went to war? He thought about his students, the ones conscripted, the ones killed. Had their fathers written letters like this? Had German soldiers killed boys whose fathers were trying to explain why they had to fight? Vasily carefully folded Weber's letter and put it in his pocket. He took the photograph as well. A family portrait showing a man in civilian clothes with a woman and a small girl. Happy. Before war. For the next 2 days, Vasily moved mechanically through his duties. He took his position, watched for targets, but didn't shoot. Other snipers in his unit recorded kills. Vasily reported seeing nothing. His sergeant noticed, but said nothing. Everyone had bad days, especially in Stalingrad's final nightmare. On February 18th, Vasily's unit received orders to advance toward a German fallback position. They were to clear remaining enemy forces from a sector near a rail yard. Vasily moved with his spotter, a young soldier named Mikhail, into a good vantage point in a destroyed grain elevator. They settled in and began scanning. Within minutes, Mikhail spotted a target. German officer, 400 meters, exposed position, smoking a cigarette. "Beautiful shot," Mikhail whispered. "Officer rank, easy range, take him." Vasily set up. Range, wind, elevation, all automatic calculations now. He could make this shot blindfolded. The German stood perfectly still, oblivious to danger, enjoying his cigarette in a rare moment of peace. Vasily looked through his scope. The magnification brought the target close. He could see details: the officer's tired face, the way he held his cigarette, the decorations on his uniform collar. The collar insignia identified him as a major. Wehrmacht, same rank as Weber. Then Vasily saw the satchel at the man's feet. Same type as the one he'd found with Weber's letters. Same weathered leather, same personal effects quality. Vasily's finger touched the trigger. This was it. An easy kill. Number 127. One more tally mark. One less enemy. But he couldn't stop seeing the unfinished letter. "I don't know how to be a good father and a good soldier simultaneously." Was this Weber? Had Vasily somehow, impossibly, found the man who'd written that letter? Or was this another German father, another former teacher, another man trying to reconcile duty and conscience? "What are you waiting for?" Mikhail whispered urgently. "Take the shot." Vasily's finger tightened on the trigger. Professional instinct took over. Breathe. Aim. Squeeze. But something stopped him. Some thought, some memory, some last vestige of the literature teacher who'd once told students that words preserve humanity even in darkness. Weber's words echoed. "You see things that make those stories hard to believe." How does any of this keep you safe? Vasily exhaled slowly and lifted his finger from the trigger. "Wind shift," he told Mikhail. "Shot's not clean. He'll move in a second." The German officer finished his cigarette, picked up his satchel, and walked back inside the building. The moment passed. Mikhail looked at Vasily strangely, but said nothing. That night, Vasily sat alone and reopened Weber's letter. He read it again, trying to understand why these words had stopped him from taking a shot he'd taken 126 times before without hesitation. He realized Weber's letter had reminded him that enemies were people, not fascists, not invaders, not targets, people. Fathers trying to explain war to daughters, teachers forced to become soldiers, men questioning whether they'd failed at everything important, just like Vasily himself. For 2 years, Vasily had survived by dehumanizing his targets. Each one was the enemy, not a person. Tally marks, not lives. It was the only way to kill repeatedly without losing your mind. But Weber's unfinished letter had rehumanized them. And once you see enemies as people, really see them, not as abstract concepts, but as individuals with daughters and doubts and unfinished thoughts, killing them becomes unbearably different. Over the next week, Vasily had 3 more clear shots. He took none of them. He invented excuses, bad angles, risk of counter-sniper fire, targets not valuable enough. His sergeant grew concerned. Political officers asked questions. Was Vasily losing his nerve? Suffering combat exhaustion? "I'm fine," Vasily insisted, "just being more selective. Quality over quantity." But he wasn't fine. He'd lost something essential, the ability to see enemies as anything other than people. and that made him useless as a sniper. In early March, as the last German forces surrendered in Stalingrad, Vasily requested transfer from sniper duty. His superiors were surprised. He was one of their most effective assets, but his record was strong enough that they couldn't refuse. Vasily was reassigned to a rifle company. Standard infantry work. He would still fight, still kill when necessary in direct combat. But he wouldn't have to line up deliberate shots on individual human beings and choose to end their specific lives. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even moral high ground. It was just the minimum adjustment needed to keep functioning. Vasily kept Weber's letter throughout the rest of the war. He survived campaigns in Ukraine, Poland, and ultimately Germany itself. He killed in combat. You couldn't fight through 1943 to 45 without killing, but he never returned to sniping. Never again took those deliberate, calculated shots where you watched a specific person die because you chose to pull the trigger. When the war ended in May 1945, Vasily was in Berlin. He'd survived 4 years of the worst warfare humanity ever created. 126 men had died by his deliberate choice. Hundreds more probably died from his rifle fire in general combat. He had nothing. No family, no home, no idea what peace even meant. He still carried Weber's letter. He'd carried it through every battle, every advance, every desperate retreat. It had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder that the enemy had been people all along, and he'd spent 2 years trying to forget that obvious truth. After demobilization, Vasily returned to Ukraine. His village was rubble. The school was gone. He found no record of Elena or what had happened to her. Probably she'd died in the chaos of 1941. Probably his child had died with her, if the child had even been born. Vasily moved to Kiev and eventually found work teaching again. Not literature and poetry, those felt impossible after everything he'd seen, but basic literacy. Teaching adults to read, mostly veterans and refugees who'd lost schooling to the war. He never spoke about his sniping days. When students or colleagues asked about his military service, he said simply, "I fought, I survived, that's all." But every year, on February 13th, the date on Weber's letter, Vasily would take out that folded paper and read it again. He thought about Gretchen, who would be growing up in post-war Germany. He wondered if her father had survived. He wondered if she ever got answers to the questions Weber tried to explain. Mostly, he thought about the shot he didn't take on February 18th, the German major he let walk away because he couldn't stop seeing Weber's words about being a father and a soldier simultaneously. Was that Major Weber himself? Was it another father with another daughter? Vasily never knew. The chaos of Stalingrad's final days made identifying that specific officer impossible. German records from that period were incomplete or destroyed. But in a strange way, not knowing was fitting. Because the point wasn't whether that specific man lived or died. The point was that Vasily had finally, belatedly, recognized that every target he'd ever lined up had been someone's son, possibly someone's father, definitely someone. 126 someones who died before Weber's letter reminded him of that truth. In 1961, 16 years after the war's end, Vasily received an unexpected letter. It was from West Germany, forwarded through multiple channels. The sender was a woman named Gretchen Weber, now 26 years old. She'd been researching her father's wartime service. He'd died in Stalingrad in February 1943, cause of death unclear, and had somehow connected with Soviet veteran organizations trying to account for missing persons and return personal effects. Gretchen explained that Soviet authorities had found her father's belongings in 1943, but only recently begun returning them as relations thawed slightly during the Cold War's brief warming. Among those belongings was a note, written in Russian, saying, "Found unfinished letter from Major H. Weber. If possible, return to family." He tried to explain himself to his daughter. She deserves to know he tried. The note was unsigned, but included a Kiev address where further correspondence could be sent. Gretchen was writing to that address, Vasily's address, though neither of them knew it yet, to ask if the person who'd written that note knew anything more about her father's final days. Vasily stared at the letter for 2 hours before responding. What could he tell her? The truth was impossible. "I found your father's letter. I read his private thoughts. I didn't shoot a German officer shortly after. Maybe because of those thoughts? Maybe because that officer was your father? Maybe because I finally understood that enemies are people." Instead, Vasily wrote carefully, "I found your father's belongings in ruins after battle. I read part of his letter to you. I'm sorry. It felt like intrusion. But his words were powerful. He wrote about loving you, about questioning war, about trying to be a good father. I thought you should have his words, even unfinished. I don't know the circumstances of his death, but I know he was thinking of you near the end. That should matter." He included Weber's original letter. He'd kept it for 18 years, and sent it through the same channels that had delivered Gretchen's inquiry. 3 months later, Gretchen wrote back. Her letter was remarkable for its generosity. "Thank you for preserving my father's words. My mother told me he was a good man who hated the war, but did his duty. Your note confirmed that. You wrote, 'Enemies are people.' Those 3 words explain so much about war's tragedy. My father was your enemy. You were his. But you preserved his letter to me. That makes you more than an enemy. I don't know what it makes you, but thank you." The letter was unfinished. He never told me what he wanted me to know at the end. For years, I wondered what those final words might have been. Then I realized maybe the point was that he tried to explain. Maybe that's enough. He tried to help me understand, even knowing I was too young, even knowing he might not survive to see if I understood. You did something similar. You found a stranger's letter and made sure it reached his daughter. You didn't have to do that. The war was over. It didn't benefit you. But you did it anyway. Maybe that's the human thing, trying to preserve what matters, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't change anything. Vasily kept Gretchen's letter alongside his other war memories, the notebook with tally marks, the photograph of Weber's family, the correspondence they'd shared. He never told her about being a sniper, about the 126 kills, about the shot he didn't take. What purpose would that serve? Gretchen knew her father died at Stalingrad. She knew someone had found his letter and cared enough to preserve it. That was enough. Vasily taught literacy classes for another 20 years. He was patient with struggling students, understanding when they became frustrated. He knew what it was to fail at something important, to try repeatedly and see no progress, to question whether you'd ever master the skill that seemed so easy for others. He died in 1981, at age 66. Among his possessions, his executor found 2 letters, Weber's unfinished explanation to his daughter, and Gretchen's thank you note saying, "Enemies are people." The executor, following instructions Vasily had left, sent both letters back to Gretchen in Germany with a note explaining that Vasily had been the Soviet veteran who'd preserved her father's words and carried them for 38 years. Gretchen, now 46, wrote about receiving this final correspondence in a 1982 letter to a friend. The letter was later published in a German veterans magazine. I learned that the Soviet soldier who saved my father's letter was a sniper. He killed many Germans. Maybe he killed my father. There's no way to know. But reading my father's words stopped him from killing someone else. One letter, unfinished, changed one decision. That's all. One small thing in a massive war. But small things matter. My father tried to explain himself to me, knowing I was too young to understand. A Soviet sniper preserved those words, knowing they served no tactical purpose. I received them decades later, knowing they came from my father's last days. Each of these acts was small. Together, they mean something. They mean that even in war, some people try to stay human. Not successfully. My father participated in a terrible war. The Soviet sniper killed many people. But they tried. In their small ways, at their crucial moments, they chose humanity over efficiency. That's not redemption. It's not even heroism. It's just the minimum we owe ourselves, to try, even when trying seems pointless. The story of Vasily Kozlov and Hans Weber is documented in scattered Soviet military records, German casualty reports, and post-war correspondence preserved by Gretchen Weber's family. It's not a famous story. No monuments commemorate it, no films dramatize it, but it represents something important about war that official histories often miss: the internal struggle between seeing enemies as targets or as people. How dehumanization makes killing possible, but rehumanization makes it unbearable. How one unfinished letter from a father to a daughter could stop a trained killer from completing his mission. Vasily never claimed moral superiority for not taking that February 18th shot. He'd already taken 126 shots. He'd killed efficiently and without hesitation for 2 years. Not shooting once didn't balance that ledger, but it did something else. It reminded him, forced him to remember, that every target was a person. Every kill ended a specific life that someone somewhere valued. Every tally mark represented a father who'd never finish explaining himself to his daughter, a son who'd never return to his mother, a teacher who'd never instruct students again. Understanding that truth didn't make Vasily better than soldiers who never understood it. It just made continuing to kill impossible for him personally. Some men can hold both truths simultaneously. Enemies are people, but you killed them anyway. Vasily couldn't. Weber's letter broke whatever mental mechanism had allowed that compartmentalization. In her 1982 letter, Gretchen Weber wrote, "I think my father would be glad his words stopped someone from killing, even if just once, even if too late to change anything that mattered." He tried to stay human in an inhuman situation. The Soviet sniper tried to do the same. That they both struggled, both partially failed, both kept trying. That's the real story. We remember the generals and the big battles, but war is fought by individuals making choices in impossible circumstances. My father chose to write an honest letter instead of propaganda. The Soviet sniper chose to preserve that letter instead of destroying it. Later, he chose not to shoot, just once, because of what he'd read. These aren't grand choices. They didn't change history, but they changed the individuals who made them. And maybe that's the point. Maybe staying human isn't about winning or losing, but about continuing to make those small choices, even when they cost you everything. Vasily Kozlov's notebook with 126 tally marks sits in a Russian military archive. Hans Weber's unfinished letter to his daughter sits in a German peace education center. Gretchen Weber's correspondence about both men has been published in multiple languages. Together, they tell a story about war that official histories overlook. The moment when killing becomes impossible, not because you've lost the will to fight, but because you've remembered that the enemy is human. That moment doesn't come from moral superiority or sudden enlightenment. It comes from something simple and devastating: reading a father's words to his daughter and recognizing yourself in those words. For Vasily, that recognition came too late to spare 126 lives, but it came in time to spare at least one more. And it came in time to preserve Weber's letter for his daughter, giving Gretchen something her father never could: proof that he tried to explain, even knowing explanation was impossible, even knowing he'd run out of time. That's not a victory. It's not redemption. It's just the smallest possible human gesture in the middle of humanity's greatest failure. But sometimes, the smallest gestures are the only ones we can make. And making them, despite everything, is how we prove we're still human. Vasily Kozlov pulled the trigger 126 times. On attempt 127, he finally couldn't, because of an unfinished letter from a father to a daughter, explaining why war makes being a good person impossible, but trying anyway. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Try anyway, even when it's too late, even when it doesn't matter, even when the attempt itself costs everything. Try anyway.